So good evening, everyone, and welcome to our Cambridge Festival event for the evening, hosted by the Cambridge Biomedical Research Centre. And tonight we are bringing you a short presentation by two of our researchers about what research tells us about a healthy weight. And just to give you a bit of an idea of how the evening's going to run, we've got about 40 minutes worth of presentation from our two esteemed researchers, and then there'll be the chance for you to ask your questions using the Q&A function. So for those of you who haven't had the chance to use Zoom before, if you look at the bottom of your screen, there should be a little bit called Q&A, and you can type any questions that you have throughout the talks into that button. Now, we are expecting quite a large audience this evening. We've already got nearly 100 people, so we probably won't be able to answer all questions, but we have really appreciated the questions that some of you have already sent in for us, and the talks have been slightly structured around those, and then we will answer as many as we can in the Q&A session at the end. My name's Amanda Stranks. I'm the Patient and Public Involvement Coordinator for the Cambridge Biomedical Research Centre, and it's my job to bring events like this to members of the public. And tonight I'm delighted to be joined by two researchers from our BRC, starting with Professor Nick Wareham, who's going to kick off the evening sharing some of his research about healthy weight. So over to you, Professor Wareham.
Thanks very much, Amanda, and thanks everybody for joining us on this beautiful evening. So I'm going to start this evening and going to talk about the issue of energy balance. And I'm joined by Amy Ahern, who's a program leader in our unit. And Amy's going to talk more about how we achieve weight loss in the face of obesity. And we've adapted our talk in light of the questions that you've put in, and we're very happy to address others in the Q&A as we go along and come to them at the end of our talk. So I want to start by saying something about what we know about the temporal trends in obesity prevalence in the UK. This will be very familiar to the whole audience. And we know that the prevalence of obesity here in blue has been rising steadily, at least since the early 90s, and continues to rise in the UK. And it's joined by, in grey, the prevalence, if you combine overweight and obesity, that also has been increasing from very high levels and affects over half of the adult population. Now, if you turn that question around and say, what is the prevalence of overweight and obesity in different age categories, you start to see a picture that shows you that increases as people get older, and the prevalence of overweight and obesity is highest in those in midlife, falls off a little bit in later life, and the same is true in general in women. And if you took this as a focus of where our attention should be, you might be giving most of the attention about obesity towards the end, or at least the middle of life. But of course, if our focus is on weight gain and the maintenance of healthy weight, we probably need to take a different approach. And I'll come to that in a second, but we need to consider whether the health risks of obesity are the same in all individuals, a topic we'll discuss. But in general, everybody on this call will be familiar with the wide diversity of health risks associated with obesity, which affects almost every system in the body and gives rise to considerable shortening of life, excess morbidity, healthcare costs, and indeed impact on the wider economy. So at what stage of adult life is the rate of weight gain greatest? We've just seen that people get more obese as they get older. In fact, if we want to look at that question, we have to have a population-based cohort study. And we're fortunate in Cambridge to have one called the Fenland study, which we've been studying now for 20 years, 12,500 people who very kindly agreed to help us with our research across Cambridgeshire, in Cambridge, Ely and Wisbech, and have attended for detailed metabolic characterization and objective measurement of their behaviors. And what that tells us about weight gain is the following. Actually, if we group people here by age category, this is for men in the left and women on the right, you see that the rate of weight gain in terms of the weight gain in kilograms per year is greatest in the youngest people. And actually, by the time people get to mid to later life, actually, on average, they're starting to lose weight. Now, this is probably a function of not gaining any further fat mass and actually losing muscle mass. But you would draw your attention to the earlier phase of life into people in early adulthood, because that's the point at which rate of weight gain is greatest. So it would change your strategy. Indeed, if we go back even further than that, this is a plot for girls in the dotted lines and boys in the solid lines. This is weight gain in terms of kilograms per year starting at birth. And obviously, there's a very considerable weight gain in the first year of life and a peak at the period of adolescence. But I want to return later to this period of life as a critical one in terms of setting the scene and programming later obesity risk. So one of the questions that one needs to address, if we're generally in energy balance, how much does it need to be out of kilter in order to lead to weight gain? So for that to happen, energy intake needs to exceed energy expenditure. And there are some very detailed quantitative analyses that allow us to quantify how much you need to be out in order to get weight gain. Now, you'll probably be relieved to know I'm not going to go into the algebra behind this, but essentially, if somebody has to gain 2.2 pounds or 1 kilogram a year, which is not so far off what you see in some populations, your energy balance, the difference between your intake and expenditure, needs to be out by a tiny amount. In fact, it needs to be out by 71 kilojoules per day or 17 calories. Now, that's some people are good on calories, some people are good on kilojoules, but everybody knows what a hobnob is. So 17 calories is a quarter of a hobnob. Now, I'm not saying that eating a quarter of a hobnob a day causes weight gain. What I'm saying is the difference between intake and expenditure is a tiny amount of calories. That means the system is very well adapted to balance energy intake and energy expenditure, but it is not perfect. So just want to say a few words about what research has told us about how does that balance occur and how is energy balance regulated. So essentially, there is several elements of the system which all center on the top in the brain, in the hypothalamus. But that talks to our pancreas, which secretes insulin. It talks to the adipose tissue, which secretes leptin, and it talks to the gut, the duodenum, stomach, and the other parts of the gut, which secrete incretin hormones. Now, this is relevant because it tells us something about biology of appetite, but it also tells us about potential treatments. I'm going to come back later to talk a little bit about leptin, because leptin is a hormone that signals to the brain that the body's got enough fat. And if you don't have leptin, the body thinks you haven't got fat, ergo you need to pile it on. You need to create energy stores, and that creates problems. Obviously, insulin controls glucose, but it also affects hunger. Alpha MSH acts on this hormone in the brain, which is called melanocortin, and I'll show you some data about gene receptors mutations that cause obesity. And Amy is going to talk a little bit about novel drugs which affect the GLP-1 receptor, so the glucagon-like peptide 1 receptor, which is a target of novel therapies. GLP-1 is secreted from the gut. It's telling the brain that you're full and you shouldn't eat anymore. So some of the new therapies work via that mechanism. Now, that's control of the energy intake. The control of the energy expenditure is somewhat different. So most of energy expenditure is resting energy expenditure. A small element is a function of what's called diet-induced thermogenesis, which is the heat and the energy relating to actually the process of eating. And then a reasonable amount, but not a massive amount, is due to physical activity, of which about half is sort of insensible physical activity, just going about everyday lives, and probably the other half is recreation or volitional type of physical activity, which is a small part of total energy expenditure. So I want to show you one thing about control, about what happens to energy expenditure when people go into negative energy balance. So this is data from a study where people are losing weight. So the x-axis here is weight change. So most of them are negative. And the y-axis on the left is change in total energy expenditure. So you can see if you lose weight, total energy expenditure is going down. And on the left, it's mostly due to a decrease in resting energy expenditure. So the body is adapting to being in negative energy balance by reducing energy expenditure. And it does that in order to put a brake on, because it is not good for a system to be in negative energy balance, because you would eventually wither away and die. So the system has got inbuilt brakes, which are partly to do with hunger, those hormones I just showed you, but also this adaptation of resting energy expenditure to stop you losing any further weight. And that's one of the explanations why weight loss is so difficult to maintain in the longer term, because this brake comes on. But we'll see that in some of Amy's slides. So what are the individual drivers of positive energy balance and weight gain? Well, I mentioned leptin before. So my colleagues Steve O'Reilly and Sadaf Faruqi have worked on rare individuals who have genetic mutations in the leptin gene and who have leptin deficiency. So they have a mutation that means they have no leptin, and the body thinks that they're starving, when in fact they're not. So there's a very strong hunger drive. And on the left, this is the weight gain in an individual compared to normal centiles by age. And you can see they pile on the weight. But fortunately, in this case, there is a therapy, and this is a marvelous piece of science. And at this point here, at the age of 9, this individual started on leptin replacement therapy and lost weight. And you can see with months of treatment, that weight loss is continued. Now, that's terrific for that individual. Unfortunately, leptin treatment is great for these very rare individuals, but doesn't have much relevance to the large numbers of people with obesity. But it's an amazing piece of science that tells us about biology and tells us that obesity has biological origins and is treatable. Another classic example is one that related to that central receptor that I showed you in the brain, the melanocortin-4 receptor. And in individuals with mutations in that, and this is the commonest cause of single gene or monogenic obesity, you can see very rapid weight gain that occurs throughout early life, and also height gain. So individuals with this particular mutation tend to be taller as well as bigger. Now, those are rare variants, but what about common genetic variants? So our group has led a lot of work on this, and this is, we call this a Manhattan plot because it looks like the skyscraper the size in Manhattan, and each of these peaks is a single nucleotide polymorphism or a single variant, and there in this analysis there'll be 30 million for each individual, and we're at the case now of analyzing that across a million individuals. And the y-axis is the strength of association and significance. And you can see some very strong peaks. There's one in FTO and other genes, including MC4R. Now, individually, these don't cause a massive change. But if you put them together in what's called a polygenic risk score, you can see they're very big differences. So this underlying this is the normal distribution of how many people have a certain number of these risk alleles. So very few people at the top have a lot, and a very few people at the other end have a few. Most people have something in the middle. But the line here is the association with mean body mass index. So the definition of obesity is 30. So you can see amongst the general population, people who are unfortunate, have a bad set of genes, have a mean BMI that's nearly 31. And at the other end, there are some people who, by the throw of dice of their hereditary, have a mean BMI of 27.5. So big differences caused by multiple genes of small effect. And this has implications for how we might think about risk moving forward. So I just wanted to take a diversion to say, are there any genetic determinants of unhealthy weight gain? Because not all weight gain gives rise to the same adverse health effects. So one of the things that impacts on the health risks of obesity is being in overloading the fat cells, the adipocytes, and getting ectopic lipid depositions, both in the, so one of the places is the liver, which becomes full of fat, and the other viscera, and this gives rise to many of the health effects. Now, that happens in most individuals just because of energy overload, but there are some rare individuals who have a genetic cause of inability to store fat in the safe places. So they tend to be thin in the face, thin in the legs, and if they have energy overload, they tend to get marked central obesity around the middle and in the viscera like the liver. And these people are rare, but there are people in the population who have something that looks like this. So here's a DEXA scan. So it's an image of someone's fat. So the red areas are where the fat is. And this person is someone who has poorly controlled type 2 diabetes and actually was sent up to our clinic because the GP said they weren't really trying hard enough because their control was poor. But actually, they'd lost 35 kilograms in weight. And on their step counter that I looked at, they were doing 10,000 steps a day. Now, this is a normal participant on the right of the same age, sex, and overall level of obesity. And this is the normal pattern of fat that you'd see. Lots of fat in the legs, a lot in the subcutaneous areas, and some here in the liver. But you compare the one on the right to the one on the left. This person has no fat whatsoever in the legs. So they can't store the fat in the safe place. And in the face of energy overload, they're storing it where it's really unhealthy. So the same thing is true in the general population. So on the left-hand side is a plot of putting people into fifths of their risk of having insulin resistance. And you can see there is a strong association with fat mass in the legs. So the people in quintile 5 can't store fat very well in their legs. And on the right-hand side, you can see they have a much higher risk of diabetes. So that phenomenon I just showed you with one patient does apply to the general population. And yes, there are differences between us in overall genetic risk, but there are also differences between us in how we store that fat and the risk that's associated with that. So not everything is about genetics. I mentioned the early life factors, and my colleague Ken Ong has done really elegant work amongst individuals who are have a low birth weight, and then in the first 6 months of life rapidly catch up. So they go from being low, small babies to being overfed, and that gives rise, if you follow those individuals up, that's called catch-up growth. You can see that in this study in Sweden, at the age of 17, the individuals who rapidly caught up that growth, as opposed to staying on their growth curve, had a much greater fat mass. And this issue of early life is something that our team are actively investigating and indeed have been doing trials of, which we can talk more in the Q&A. Of course, change in weight is also related to other behaviors. So my colleague Soren Braga has shown here that people whose physical activity goes down over time in the Finland study are those with the highest weight gain over time. So physical activity is an important part, but it's difficult to demonstrate. For diet, I want to rely on some data from another of our studies, which is called Epic Norfolk, which has got 25,000 people in, and is part of a European study with 500,000. And in that study, we showed that here, the many different dietary factors are associated with likelihood of weight gain. I'm focusing here for today just on meat consumption, and this is expressed in terms of 100 calories of meat. What is the effect on weight gain per year? And it's very small. It's around the bottom here, 25 grams a year on average excess weight gain for 100 calories of meat. And you might ask, what is 100 calories of meat? 100 calories of meat is approximately equal to 2 slices of processed ham. So little differences in that behavior between people give rise to relatively small differences in weight gain, but they accumulate across different behaviors. We've also studied the question of when you eat most of your calories. So this is a plot of, in the EPIC Norfolk study, of weight gain over 3.5 or so years between repeats, plotted against the percentage of your total energy intake eaten at breakfast. And you can see people who eat more of their calories earlier in the day are less likely to gain weight. And you can imagine this got quite a lot of press coverage with titles like this, breakfast like a king, lunch like a prince, and dine like a pauper. And obviously there are other variations on this, but they are backed up by evidence. So I want to close by saying something about moving from individuals to populations. So what are the drivers of weight gain at the population level, and how can we impact on them? And I've showed you figures about the prevalence of obesity and change. What's actually happened is the whole distribution of body mass index in the population has shifted. So this is the distribution in different ages of time. In the hashes is the 1990s, and the solid lines are the distribution in 2016 to 18. And you can see that the whole distribution has moved to the right. And this is in adults, but you see the same thing in children as well. A shift of the whole distribution to the right-hand side. So this is a phenomenon where kind of everyone is getting just a little bit more overweight. It's not restricted to one subgroup of the population. And when you think like that, you have to take a different perspective, and you have to move away from the things I've been talking about, which is about individual risk factors, to start thinking about the things we share, the general socioeconomic environment in which we live, work, and play. And this is very much the sort of philosophy that Jeffrey Rose wrote about in his Strategy of Preventive Medicine, where he said the only effective approach for dealing with these public health epidemics, of which obesity is the classic one, is to understand how we can shift the distribution back to the left. And that requires a different type of science that's complementary to the type of science I showed you already. And we did that in a center called CEDAR, which has been operating since the mid-2000s, trying to understand things like how is walking influenced by how we build our environment. And in the UK Biobank, we showed that people who live in high walkable areas do indeed walk more, and there's strong inverse relationships with socio-economic deprivation. But if you want to take that type of evidence and turn it into interventions, you can't do what we do with medical type interventions. So if we're thinking about cycling, we might want the UK to be more like Copenhagen, but you can't randomize the UK or bits to be more like Copenhagen. But you can do quasi-experimental studies. So here's one that we did involving a natural experiment of investment in cycling infrastructure across the UK in different places. And what the group showed, led by David Ogilvie and colleagues, was that in those places which were intervention towns, which were investing in promoting cycling, there was an increase in likelihood of cycling with its health benefits. But in other comparison towns, there was not. So evidence that this is working. The same is true of the food environment. Our food environment is a big influence on what we eat. And my colleague Tom Burgoyne studied that in the Fenton study, and he did it by just adding up how many takeaways people pass on their way between home and work. And the average was 32, but some people pass as many as 165. Big variation between people. And if you plot on the top people into quartiles. So a quarter of the population is in each of these groups. People who are most exposed have a very much higher body mass index, and at the bottom they also eat more takeaway food. So the environment is having a big impact on people's takeaway food and their likelihood of obesity. And Tom has taken that data and created a tool that helps local authorities make decisions about planning. And an example would be in Wolverhampton, who took Tom's tool and have actually used it to try and stop the proliferation of takeaways on their high streets. Different type of data. Other types of intervention are possible. So in 2014-15, I gave evidence to the House of Commons Health Committee about whether the government should introduce fiscal interventions, taxation. And nobody on the committee wanted to know, because at the time it wasn't government policy, it wasn't opposition policy, so nobody wanted to know. Probably our research had some small impact. Probably a bigger influence was the fact that the next person speaking was Jamie Oliver, so he might have had a greater influence than me. But in the end, George Osborne did announce in 2016 a sugar levy. And subsequently, our group has evaluated whether that's having an impact on obesity. So my colleagues Martin White and Jean Adams do a large NIHR-funded evaluation, which is quasi-experimental, showing in blue is what's observed and in red is what expected, that actually there's been a decrease in obesity consequent on the soft drinks industry levy. And actually that has been greatest in areas of greatest social deprivation. So things are working. And I kind of want to end on a note of hope, because around the world, there's a sense that, obesity is inevitable and we're not making any traction. But I think there is some indication that that may not be true. So this is a plot of the prevalence of overweight in very young children around the world. In red is what you're seeing in all the WHO developed countries, and in dotted blue is what you see in the developing world. And there are, 4 countries which are bucking the trend. So New Zealand has been showing a decline. Victoria and Australia, a bit of a decline. Germany also plateauing, and the UK beginning to plateau, peaked during COVID for reasons we can discuss, and has dropped subsequently. And the thing that actually is common between these 4 countries is governmental investment in preschool care for children. So I think this is an indication that this is an early phase of life, and probably the point, like some flowers in the springtime, when you just begin to see things happening early. Now, I might be an optimist, but I think that we have to do the right research. And with the help of people in Cambridgeshire who contribute to our studies, I think we have been doing that, and there is a note of optimism to end on. And I'd like to thank all my colleagues whose data I've described today, and hand back to Amanda and then on to Amy. So thank you.
Brilliant. Thanks, Professor Wareham. Really interesting introduction and overview of all of the research to date. So it is now my absolute pleasure to welcome Dr. Amy Ahern to share her research about obesity and overweight. So over to you, Amy.
Thanks, Amanda, and thank you to Nick. So as Nick said, I'm going to talk more about how to achieve and sustain a healthy weight loss when somebody already has developed overweight and obesity. Oh, slides are not working. Sorry, I'm going to stop and reshare. Is that showing in presenter view?
So there, at the moment, it's showing you need to put it into presenter view for us.
There we go.
Now they're moving.
Okay, sorry about that. So judging by a lot of the questions that were submitted ahead of time, we know that many of you would like to know a little bit more about the game-changing obesity medications that have hit the market and the headlines in recent years. For the first time, we have relatively safe and very effective obesity medications that can help people to achieve weight losses of around 15 to 20% of body weight, which previously was unheard of without some kind of surgery. So we're going to talk a little bit about how do they work and how much do they really change the game. So the first of the drugs that came to market was semaglutide, otherwise known as Ozempic or Wegovy. And as Nick alluded to earlier, this is something we call a GLP-1 agonist. And what that means is it mimics the effect of a hormone called glucagon-like peptide 1 that occurs naturally in the body. The medication is administered by a subcutaneous injection. And you can see here that it works on multiple organs. And 3 of the key ways that it helps people to lose weight is by improving blood sugar control, by increasing insulin secretion and reducing glucagon release into the bloodstream. But it also has a powerful effect on appetite, both by reducing gastric emptying, which slows the rate at which food leaves the stomach, and increases feelings of fullness, and also powerful effects on food cravings. And people talk a lot about how it quietens the food noise and the desire to eat that many people living with obesity describe experiencing. And the effects of this drug are considerable. So previously, you might hope for around 5% of weight loss. And what we see in the landmark trials of semaglutide are weight loss is more in the region of 10 to 15%. So this is the step 5 trial that had a 2.4 milligram injection of semaglutide and looked at the effects over 2 years in people with overweight and obesity and at least one comorbidity. And what they see over 2 years is that actually people are losing around 15% of their body weight. However, hot on the heels of semaglutide came tirzepatide, and this combines the effect of a GLP-1 agonist with a GIP, or glucose dependent insulinotropic polypeptide. We'll call it GIP. And GIP is also a hormone that occurs in the body, and this one increases insulin sensitivity, which also improves blood glucose control. And it also works on appetite, but this time by reducing the secretion of stomach acid and slowing the rate at which food is broken down. And so when you combine the effects of GIP and the GLP-1 agonist, it leads to even greater weight loss. And this trial looked at the effects over just over a year, and we're seeing weight losses more in the region of around 20% of weight loss. These drugs are just the start. This sort of market analysis shows a raft of new medications that are due to enter the market in the next 5 years. I'm not going to talk about all of them, mostly because I can't pronounce all of them. But I did want to highlight a few of the types of medications that we're going to be seeing. So the first of these are ones that actually combine even more hormone targets. So for example, retatrutide actually is called what we call a triple agonist. So it targets GLP-1, it targets GIP, but it also works on glucagon. And again, by adding more hormones in, you're seeing that actually you're achieving even greater weight losses. The other type of medication that is going to be a bit of even more of a game changer is orforglipron, which is an oral medication rather than an injection. So one of the big drawbacks of the semaglutide and tirzepatide is that they're administered by this subcutaneous injection. You've probably all seen the pens in the news. And these are not acceptable to everybody. They also need to be refrigerated. So orforglipron is an oral form that even if it doesn't have quite the strong effects of all the others, and actually the phase 3 trials suggest that it's nearing those 15–20% of weight loss, that actually because it's an oral form and a pill, it is both more acceptable to patients and more feasible from a logistics point of view of not needing the refrigeration, etc. And the other one I wanted to highlight was bimagrabine. So what that does is it supports muscle development. And what we see with rapid and severe weight loss is that you not only lose fat, but you also lose lean mass and muscle. And so by adding in something that supports muscle development, you are able to mitigate some of those effects on and protect the lean and muscle mass. So they're very impressive, and I mean, it is just certainly the case that they have changed the game. Weight losses of 15 to 20% were unheard of without surgery previously, and they're a very powerful tool in the treatment of obesity, but they're not a silver bullet. For starters, they aren't suitable for everyone. Not everybody wants to take injectable medications. Not everybody wants to take medication at all. And even amongst those who start on these medications, up to 71% stop taking them within a year. Partly the reason for that is substantial side effects. They're primarily gastrointestinal, things like nausea, vomiting, diarrhea. But even though they might not sound particularly severe, living with those is not something that people necessarily want to do. And that is going to be off-putting for taking these in the longer term. The medications are also of a high cost. So that sort of 2.4 milligram dosage could actually end up costing about £300 a month. And so with a large eligible population and a national health service, we are not able to meet the need for everybody who would be eligible for these medications. And so what ends up happening there is that actually people are paying for these prescriptions privately. And of course, if you're paying £300 a month for a medication, it may be that you're not able to sustain that in the longer term. And that as soon as that initial weight loss is achieved, you may decide to stop taking them. Another reason why they're not a complete replacement for everything else we've got is that you still need behavioural support while taking these medications. Partly that's to ensure that you're getting adequate nutrition. So we know that these are powerful appetite suppressants. So instead of needing behavioural support for how do you reduce what you're eating, you will probably need behavioural support to make sure you're eating enough and enough of the right foods. You also need to be preserving this strength and lean mass that we talked about. And so that might be things like making sure you get enough protein or doing sort of strength training and resistance exercises. Behavioural support's probably also going to be important for reducing the side effects. So those gastrointestinal side effects that we talked about, there are behaviour changes you could make, such as limiting spicy food, drinking enough water, that can mitigate the effects of those side effects. And it's also important to support psychological well-being while people are taking these, both because of the effects that they may have on food reward, the impact that it has on you socially, but also the very drastic effect of weight loss and what that has on self-image. And so making sure that we provide adequate support for people's well-being and psychological well-being during this will also be important. And of course, the other reason they're not a magic bullet is that when you stop taking the medications, the weight is regained. This actually isn't that surprising, and nobody would expect that if you took an antihypertensive to lower your blood pressure, that when you stop taking it, your blood pressure would stay low. You'd expect it to come back up. And that's exactly what happens when these medications are withdrawn. So we can see here on the left a trial of semaglutide, and on the right a trial of tirzepatide, that once the drug is withdrawn, the weight rapidly increases. And this can be very distressing for patients, both the rapid weight regain, but also the rapid rebound in the appetite. So all that food noise comes back with a vengeance, and that can be very difficult for patients to deal with. There's some evidence that physical activity can moderate weight regain if it's in sufficient amounts. And there's also evidence that maybe using cheaper generic medications to sort of transition people out of these medications could be helpful. But the nature of the support that's needed and the long-term impact and cost effectiveness of different approaches is a big area of uncertainty and will be a key area of research in coming years. So while these obesity medications are game-changing, there's still going to be a large role for behavioural treatment, both as an adjunct to medications, as a follow-on from medications, but also for most people, it's going to be the first-line treatment of overweight and obesity for the foreseeable future. So I'm going to talk a little bit about what behavioural treatment is and how it can help to achieve and maintain a healthy weight. So it's important to say at the beginning that behavioural treatment recognises all the complex determinants of obesity. And we know it isn't a simple case of eat less, move more. But it still maintains that actually by making changes in behaviour, we can support healthy weight management. And the types of intervention you see are very varied. They might be one-to-one, they might be group-based, they could be in person, or increasingly they're delivered remotely or digitally. They could be led by specialist healthcare providers, or it could be trained non-specialists or lay people, peer members. And increasingly, they're supported by digital technology, which has the benefits both of improving the accuracy of behavioural and outcome monitoring, but also reducing the costs and the scalability of communication with patients. And the primary focus of these behavioural treatments is on behaviours that address energy balance, and in particularly, as Nick has alluded to in his talks, those key ones are diet and physical activity. And behaviour change is achieved primarily through different strategies that improve self-regulation. So the idea of self-regulation is that you set goals, you plan how you will achieve them, and then you implement different strategies and monitor how well these strategies work. And then what you try and do is learn from and reflect on what's working, what isn't, and adjust your goals, adjust your new strategies. Goals need to be achievable so as not to undermine motivation, and they ought to be meaningful to the individual. For many, that might mean that the goal is actually not a specific number on the scale. It might be behavioural, you're wanting to meet certain diet or physical activity goals, or it might be that you want to be able to play with your grandchildren or be more physically active socially. And so making those goals meaningful to people can help with that motivation. People are about 2 to 3 times more likely to achieve a goal if they make a specific plan for when, where, and how they're going to achieve it. And then the self-monitoring comes in. Self-monitoring of weight, food intake, physical activity, it's a cornerstone of most weight management strategies. And it isn't that we expect people are going to do this for the rest of their lives and monitor themselves forever. But a period of self-monitoring helps people to notice specific patterns of behaviour and how these relate to changes in their body weight. And it can help for reflecting on which strategies are working and which ones you might need to revise. Goals and strategies, they need to be reassessed and adjusted as needed. Roadblocks, setbacks, life events, they're going to happen in the course of a weight management journey. And actually acknowledging that possibility up front and understanding that setbacks are going to happen and planning for them can be a really helpful way of helping people to move past them when they happen. So a big question we were asked, and I think it was one of the ones that's submitted, it's always a question I get asked, is what's the best diet for weight loss? And the truth is that we've got lots of diets that are very effective for achieving weight loss. And actually, they all work in a pretty similar way by increasing attention to what and how much people are eating, or limiting opportunities for eating, either by reducing the amount of time that you can eat or the sorts of foods that you can eat. These all work to reduce energy intake and achieve weight loss. In essence, the best diet is one that you can stick to. And it's important to recognise that you need to meet nutritional needs, and that excluding whole food groups is not a great way to do that. And a healthy, balanced diet also has benefits beyond weight loss in terms of your physical and mental health. So when we're thinking about one we can stick to, we're thinking about a diet that meets your social and cultural needs. Eating's a key way that we connect with other people, and it's important that a diet is not socially isolating. It also needs to be foods you enjoy. For some people, the great appeal of a sort of low carb diet is actually that they still get to eat their favorite foods if they're sort of protein or fat based. But for others, it might mean cutting out everything that they enjoy. And whereas for some people, the idea of intermittent fasting can be sort of life changing, for others, those fasting days might be absolutely unbearable. So it needs to fit with how you live your life, and including what your food budget is. And a healthy diet that meets your needs is more sustainable in the long term, and it gives you better quality of life while you're doing it, which is also equally important. In terms of physical activity, this is an important part of behavioural interventions because it's an important part of the energy balance equation. But actually, physical activity alone isn't a great way to lose weight. Partly because it's much easier to consume a large number of calories in a short pace of time than it is to burn them. You can eat, large pizza with a day's worth of calories in much quicker than you can run off the calories that you've consumed. We're talking minutes versus hours. And there's also individual differences in response to appetite, in response to physical activity. So for some people, when they exercise, their appetite actually comes down a bit, whereas for others, they're very ravenous and want to compensate for the energy that they've consumed. But physical activity is good for weight loss maintenance, and we see that those people who successfully maintain their weight in the long term actually do quite large amounts of physical activity. And of course, it's really important, again, to consider that physical activity has other health benefits beyond weight loss. And it's important that we are thinking about overall health and not simply the numbers on the scale. Another behaviour that really doesn't get as much attention, but is really important in terms of energy balance, is the quality of our sleep. And we know that poor sleep can affect energy intake by working again to disrupt those hormones that regulate hunger and making us more hungry. It can also increase the time and opportunities to eat if you're awake for longer. And also we see that it increases the rewarded value of high energy food. Understandably, when people are tired and fatigued, they're seeking out fuel. And those high energy, high sugar, high fat foods are going to be more appealing. And all those work to increase energy intake. But it also reduces physical activity, because if you're tired, you're not going to want to be as physical active. So you can see the importance of supporting healthy sleep in effective weight management. Another thing that we're looking at increasingly in behavioural interventions is the effect of stress and mood. This diagram here shows how stress is linked to obesity through physiological and biochemical changes that drive weight gain, including the impacts on the hormones that make us hungry. It also increases our cognitive load and reduces that ability for self-regulation, and undermines our ability to choose the healthier, harder behaviours. So increasingly, behavioural interventions are including strategies to reduce stress and improve emotional well-being. I particularly like this model by Tomiyama, because what it does is it also highlights that one of the reasons that people often say we have an obesity problem is we just need more individual responsibility, more blame, more shame. And we can categorically say that if blame and shame and weight stigma worked to help people lose weight, we wouldn't have an obesity problem, because they are pervasive and they're pernicious. And here is just one example of how weight stigma is actually a stressor, and how those feelings of blame and shame actually work to undermine rather than support obesity treatment and prevention. Now, the effects of behavioural treatments are much more modest than those of the medications. We're talking more like 5 to 10% weight loss over a year. And this is what we saw in the RAP trial, where we recruited people with overweight and obesity from primary care and randomised them either to 12 weeks of Weight Watchers, 52 weeks of Weight Watchers, or a brief intervention. So a very scalable commercial intervention. And what we saw was about 5 to 7 kilograms of weight loss at around 1 year, and then this gradual regain over 5 years. So that by the end of 5 years, people were around 2 to 2.5 kilograms below baseline weight, which is a really modest weight loss in comparison to the medications. But even those modest weight losses have significant impacts on other risk factors for diabetes and heart disease, and reduce the healthcare costs associated with those illnesses. So actually, over a course of 5 years, these interventions are cost effective, and potentially over a lifetime might even be cost saving. Another key concern has been what impact these interventions have on mental health, and in particularly into eating disorders. And the idea is that putting people on a weight loss diet could actually worsen their mental health and increase eating disorder risk. But what we actually see is that when we look at randomized controlled trials where people are randomly allocated to a weight loss program or a control group, you actually see small positive effects, such as reductions in anxiety and depression. And we actually see a reduction in eating disorder risk on average. That doesn't mean we don't think that some people may be at risk of developing poor mental health and eating disorders in response to weight management interventions. And I'd like to do a big shout out to the EDIT collaboration, which I've been part of, which is an international project that is working to identify from all the trials that have measured these kinds of outcomes, what are the interventions that are more or less likely to develop eating disorders, and what are the individual characteristics of the person who is more susceptible to developing these eating disorders. And I'm going to very quickly talk about weight loss maintenance before Amanda starts worrying that we're not going to have time for questions. But I think it would be remiss of me not to talk about this as the greatest challenge in obesity treatment. We've seen it with both the medications, the behavioural treatment. You also see it with bariatric surgery, that when an intervention stops, the weight is regained. We've done quite a lot of work, as have others, around this idea that more psychological support might be helpful, and that people want more psychological support. And we did a lot of evidence synthesis work around what might be the best psychological treatment. And we identified acceptance and commitment therapy as an intervention that seems to be more effective for longer term weight management. And what acceptance and commitment therapy does is it teaches skills to enact valued behaviours even when they're very challenging. It teaches strategies for accepting uncomfortable thoughts and feelings associated with doing difficult behaviours. And a lot of the strategies include things like mindfulness, improving psychological flexibility, and importantly, self-compassion. And the challenge is that these types of psychological interventions, they're delivered face-to-face by clinical psychologists, meaning that they're very hard to deliver on a large scale in an NHS context. So we spend a lot of time developing a guided self-help program that teaches skills and strategies from acceptance and commitment therapy, specifically targeting the psychological challenges of weight loss maintenance, but does it with a web platform to deliver the psychoeducational content, and then support from a non-specialist coach over the phone. And what we found in our feasibility study was that people who came off the behavioural weight management programme, those in the control group would regain 2 kilograms over the course of 6 months. So you've lost maybe about 7 or 8 kilograms and you regain 2 kilograms over 6 months. But those who took part in our swim program, they actually lost a further 2 kilograms over 6 months. And importantly, what we also saw was reductions in anxiety, depression, and emotional eating. So it seems to be supporting both the mental and the physical health. Now, this was a feasibility study. Our primary aim was, is this engaging? Will it work? So we can't take this as concrete. And we're actually in the process of setting up a national randomized controlled trial where we'll recruit about 1,800 people, randomize them to swim or control, and then follow them up for 2 years. And we're also going to be looking at whether this type of intervention might be useful for people coming off medications and bariatric surgery. But I will end there by saying we do have a range of behavioural and pharmacological interventions to support people to achieve meaningful weight loss. And it's important that we're supporting health behaviours beyond just numbers on a scale. It's also important in future research that we learn to understand more about what works for whom and tackle this critical challenge of weight loss maintenance. So I shall stop there. Thank you.
Brilliant and super interesting. I'm sure the audience won't mind us overrunning a few minutes because it was just so helpful to have both of those parts of the story, I think, come together. Not surprisingly, we've had lots of questions come in, and I know some of the team have been answering some of them in the chat, and very helpfully, your talks already covered some of the answers, which is great. I think one of the first ones that I might start with, or there's two that are quite related, which asks around whether or not there's any studies or research that look at how other protected characteristics beyond gender affect weight. So there's questions around so protected characteristics, informal carers, and then sort of other inequalities like socioeconomic status. So do you want to comment on what we know about how that affects weight?
Yeah, so I think there's strong evidence that overweight is socially patterned, and that how we think about it as a problem has to be mindful of that, and we need to put in place solutions that not only deal with the problem of obesity in a preventive sense and a therapeutic sense, but we also seek to narrow those inequalities. And that's a very challenging thing to do. And we have to be careful about access to healthcare systems for the sorts of therapies that Amy is talking about. And I think one of our concerns with the novel therapies is that if the state doesn't get its act together in terms of providing these opportunities, people will decide to seek them of their own volition, and are actually already doing that, and that will widen social inequalities because these drugs are expensive. And in the preventive space, I think we have to be mindful of that in terms of the approach we take. So trying to deal with public health problems by encouraging people to take individual action tends to widen inequalities, because you have to have a lot of agency in order to act on information. So we try to look for low agency types of interventions that affect a lot of people. And the ones that I've described, which are really the whole population approaches to public health, they're the ones that have a chance of reducing obesity and narrowing inequalities, which is what we want.
Brilliant. To go to a slightly different angle, one of the questions that were asked, and Amy, you actually covered some of this already in your talk, but there was a question around how we be mindful of things like stigma and how that affects people's weight. And I wondered if you wanted to talk a little bit about how you work with people living with obesity to include them in research.
Yeah, so as you know, we've done a lot of patient and public involvement, and you've supported us with a lot of that. And actually, it was quite eye-opening for me when we were developing interventions, and we were often using materials that drew on existing manuals of behavior change interventions, that actually just sharing those with our PPIE group and them saying, actually, that feels stigmatizing to me, that the way that that's expressed feels blaming, and actually really working with them to actually redevelop how we explain things and how we present information to try and reduce that stigma, because it is, I mean, they come with self-stigma. You know, they were already feeling blamed and shamed from years, and it's not a helpful thing to experience in terms of any kind of treatment. And also what's been really interesting, I've found, is a lot of the narrative around the medications is also very stigmatizing, that they're an easy way out, that, you know, and they're not. They're, you know, it's still quite a lot of work to take these medications and to lose weight. And it's often the same people that are critical of people for living with obesity who are then critical of a medication that might support them. And I think helping people to navigate that and the different messages they're getting from different places is a really important part of treatment, actually.
No, I think that makes a lot of sense. In a similar vein, we've had a question that asks how we can best support people who are taking medications perhaps for their mental health that then cause them to gain weight, and whether or not any of your collective research talks to that.
So my clinical observation is that the mental health world and the physical health world are too separated. And I think it would be fair to say that we see a lot of patients in our diabetes clinics who have mental illness. And I think our colleagues who run mental health services see a lot of patients with metabolic diseases, and they're partly a consequence of the therapies, and they're partly a consequence of behaviors that are linked to the underlying disorders. And frankly, I think the system has to be more joined up and much better at, you know, seeing people as a whole and not seeing them as a metabolic system or a mental illness system. And the question is very apposite, and I think the system has to do better and to try and we are making efforts, but I think we have to try harder.
Makes sense. I know certainly a lot of the trials and the studies that you were talking about, Amy, about the different groups that some of these drugs are being tested in. Do you think there will start to be kind of crossover studies, for want of a better description, where perhaps people living with mental illness are one of the groups they'll be tried in?
Yeah, absolutely. I believe some trials are underway already around that, particularly for people who are using, for example, medications that they're associated with rapid weight gain. So I think absolutely that is trials that are coming down the road.
I can imagine there do seem to be a lot of them at the moment. Another question was around what we know about the impacts of sort of of weight during pregnancy and what the in utero effects on weight gain. So do either of you know about research that speaks to that?
So you know, one of the problems of excessive weight gain of the mother in pregnancy, and indeed people with overweight going into pregnancy, is the occurrence of gestational diabetes, which is going up in this country and can be screened for and can be treated, and good control of women who have gestational diabetes during pregnancy does reduce the risks of the complications of that in terms of fetal abnormalities, but also of the risk of having big babies, which is a bad thing in its own right, largely for mechanical reasons. But women who've had gestational diabetes often revert to normal, but they are a subgroup who should be offered preventive interventions to avoid them getting diabetes and overweight later in life. And the offspring of women who've had gestational diabetes are more at risk of diabetes themselves. And it's not quite so apparent in this country, but our research in places like South Africa show a real problem of a circularity, of a vicious circle. So women going into pregnancy early, having babies at a young age, like gestational diabetes, offspring themselves increased risk of diabetes, and a vicious cycle that perpetuates the problem. So yes, it's a great question, and it's a big issue, and Amy and her team and others are investigating approaches to try and break those vicious cycles.
Mm-hmm. Then related to that question is one that says, what is the best support that we can give teenagers or young people who are overweight or struggling with weight loss?
Want to take that, Amy?
I think the important thing is to talk to a health professional. But actually don't be afraid to have those conversations and ask for support. There are interventions out there. There's behavioural treatments that can be very effective in supporting people. We've now got sort of child excess weight clinics, which can provide more sort of specialist support. But I think actually just trying to not be brushed off with the idea that it's a problem to go away and sort yourself, but actually engaging with healthcare professionals who can help.
Mm-hmm. Okay, so we're one eye on the time. I think if we take perhaps a couple more questions, and then we can wrap up, because I'm sure we're all starting to think about the food that we eat this evening. There's a really interesting question. I know, Amy, in your talk, you talked a little bit about how almost any diet can work. It's a matter of finding the one that works for you. There's an interesting question that says, have we created self-testing strategies and guidance to support people to help themselves learn what works for them?
Well, I think really that is what a lot of the behavioural treatments do. That process I talked about of self-regulation, it can be around trying different strategies and then seeing which ones do work for you. I think a lot of those supportive behavioural programs can help you to do that. But I don't think we have a specific intervention that does that systematically, although that might be a useful approach.
Interesting thought. And then we have one question which I think actually makes quite a nice wrap up. It's going to be one of those lovely end of night questions that I'm sure you'll both love. The question says, if you could only target one, what is more important to target in today's climate, individual behaviour or socioeconomic inequities and environmental factors? Nice, simple question to finish off the night there.
It's the sort of question you get, and I've had repeatedly when you appear before Parliamentary Select Committee. What is the one thing you would do, Professor Wareham, to sort out obesity? And unfortunately, there isn't one thing. And what we need to do is, and I try to stress that in my talk, is a multitude of small things, because I think that is the way to address this problem, rather than the thought that there's a singular magic bullet. But in the interests of answering the question, if you forced me, I think we have to put serious attention behind the research that Jeffrey Rose's book tells us that the population approach is hypothetically the best one, if only you could move the distribution back to the left. I think we have to do serious science about how to do that, and how to actually tackle that as a serious system problem. And that's where I put my efforts.
Mm-hmm. Amy?
Well, I focus on individual work. I also agree that the sort of systems approach is really very, very vital. And I think actually probably has been overlooked for many, many years, and we need more research in that area. I guess for me, what I focus on is that within that system, while we're trying to shift that population curve, which is proving incredibly difficult, that there are still individuals within that we need to support.
Absolutely. So on that note, just a huge thank you to both of our speakers this evening. A really, really helpful overview of kind of everything that the research brings together and where we might want to head next. Thank you to all of you in the audience who have sent in your questions. It was really helpful between all of our team and our two speakers to be able to shape what we were talking about tonight. We will make some resources available, so the recording, once we've put some subtitles on it, and some answers to some of the questions that we didn't quite get to. But thank you, Nick, thank you, Amy, and we hope you have a lovely evening. To everyone in the audience, when you leave tonight, there'll be a short kind of a feedback survey that you can fill in, and my colleague's about to share some ways that you can get involved in research with us. So as Amy mentioned, one of the things we really like to do is speak to patients and members of the public from our region, from across the country, to involve them in our research. And we're going to share some of those opportunities with you before you go home tonight. So thanks for joining us, everyone, and thanks, Amy, and thanks, Nick. Goodbye and good night.